Hello, welcome to another First Chapter Friday. I have so much admiration for people who are going through really difficult childhoods and then they pull themselves out of all the obstacles and then they become these really successful people. And that is who this story is about, Ben Carson. So his book is called Gifted Hands, and it is the Ben Carson story, and it's told by, I believe, a husband-wife team, Gregg Lewis and Deborah Shaw Lewis. Chapter 1, Broken Home, Shattered Dreams. For a long while, Ben had sensed that something was wrong. He had not heard his parents scream or shout at one another for days. He seldom even heard them argue. Instead, they would just quit talking to each other until the whole house filled with a deep and disturbing quiet. Those silences gradually became longer and much more frequent. His father seemed to be gone more and more. Yet Ben, he was still surprised by his mother's announcement. It started like any other day for 8-year-old Ben Carson and his 10-year-old brother Curtis, but it turned unforgettably sad when their mother sat them down and announced, "Boys, your father has moved out of this house. He's not going to be living with us anymore." "I don't want him to leave," Ben cried. "Please make him come back." But his mother shook her head. "Benny, your father can't come back." "Why not?" Ben wanted to know. "He's done some bad things." And that was as much as she would tell Ben and Curtis. Ben argued with his mother. "If Daddy did something wrong, why can't you just forgive him and let him come home?" "It's not that simple," she replied, looking like she was about to cry. Ben wondered if he'd done something to make his father angry, but Ben's mother assured him that his daddy loved him very much and was not mad at him at all. Still, it hurt. Ben's heart was broken. He loved his daddy. Every night he prayed for his father to come home so their family could be together again. But that never happened. When he left, Ben's father took all the family's money, including their quote-unquote nest egg that Ben's mother had been managing to store up by scrimping and saving over the years. Mrs. Carson had no job skills or work experience, so the only way she could support herself and her 2 sons was by cleaning houses and taking care of other people's children. It was hard work, but she was determined to do whatever it took to provide for her boys. Even after he learned the truth, Ben continued to love his dad in spite of what he had done. But Ben loved and respected his mother even more. He knew how hard she worked to take care of him and Curtis, and how much his father's actions had hurt his mother. Sonia Carson, Ben's mother, had been born into a large and extremely poor rural Tennessee family. She was the next to the youngest of 24 children. Yet she only knew 13 of her siblings because she spent most of her lonely and unhappy childhood moving from one foster home to another. She had been just 13 years old when she met and married Ben's father, an older man who promised to rescue her from her sad situation and take her north to Detroit. He promised to provide her with a life of wealth and adventure. Ben's father was a charming man and a good provider. He loved parties and seemed proud of his young wife. He often bought Ben's mother expensive gifts of clothing and jewelry. Ben's father seemed to spend money as fast as he earned it. Over time, Ben's mother became concerned about their finances. After the boys were born, Ben's mother wondered where her husband was getting his extra money. She worried that he might be involved in selling alcohol or even drugs. She finally found out that he had another wife and family, and Sonia told him to leave. Ben found it tough to give up his hopes for a happy home where his family could all live together again, But the same year his father left, a new dream entered Ben's life. Ben's dream was born one Sunday morning during church. Ben sat on the edge of the pew, listening intently as their minister told an exciting true story about a missionary doctor. Here's a picture. That's of Ben, Curtis, Carson in the back row, and childhood friends. Robbers were chasing the doctor and his wife, the minister told them. They ran as fast as they could around trees and over rocks, trying to stay ahead of their pursuers. Then they came to an edge of a cliff. They had nowhere to go, but right at the very brink of the precipice, they spotted a crack in the rock just big enough for both of them to crawl into. When the bandits got to the cliff, their would-be victims were nowhere to be seen. It was as if the doctor and his wife had vanished. The robbers didn't know what to think. They stomped around, cursing, then left. The missionaries were safe. As the story ended, Ben breathed a sigh of relief. What a thrilling life missionaries must lead. God hid his missionaries in the cleft of a rock, the pastor explained, and he will do the same for you if you give him your heart and let him protect you from harm. That's what I need, thought Ben. So when the preacher invited those who wanted to give their lives to Jesus to come forward, Ben walked down the aisle to where the minister was standing. After listening to that exciting story, Ben knew two things. He wanted Jesus to watch over him, and he knew what he wanted to do with his life. I know what I will be when I grow up, Ben told his mother as they walked home from church that day. A missionary doctor. His mother stopped to look right at him. Benny, she said, if you ask the Lord for something and believe he will do it, it will happen. His mother's encouraging response confirmed the dream for him. From that time on, Ben was convinced that God wanted him to be a doctor one day. Somehow he held on to that dream, despite many other difficult things that would happen in his young life. He was no longer providing any money. Sonia had to work longer and longer hours, holding 2 or 3 jobs at a time. Many mornings, she left before dawn and wouldn't get home until her sons were already asleep. Sometimes 2 or 3 days would go by without Ben or Curtis ever seeing their mother. Her exhausting schedule, the pain and sadness she felt about the end of her marriage, the heavy responsibility of raising 2 boys alone, and her own fear and uncertainty about the future all added up to an overwhelming feeling of discouragement and depression. Sonia often worried that she might not be strong enough to make it on her own. Sometimes she wasn't even sure she could go on another day. Eventually, a few months after Ben's father had left, Sonia decided she needed help. She told the boys, I have to go away for a few days to see some relatives. Are we going too? Ben wanted to know. No, Benny, she said. I have to do this alone. Besides, you boys need to go to school, so I've made arrangements for you. Sister Scott, an elderly woman they knew from church, stayed at their house and took care of Ben and Curtis. Just until I come back, their mother told them. Sonia made it sound like a special adventure, and the boys enjoyed spending time with Sister Scott. She was a terrific listener who would focus on whatever the boys told her and would exclaim, "Oh my!" every other sentence or so. One day, Sister Scott found out that Ben and Curtis wanted to learn how to roller skate. "I can teach you," she told them, and she strapped on a pair of old-fashioned one-size-fits-all skates, the kind that fit onto one's shoes and are adjusted with a metal key. Then she gave the boys a demonstration. They created a sensation in the neighborhood. An 80-year-old woman skating up and down the sidewalk of Detroit with 2 boys in tow. Ben and Curtis had all they could do to keep up with her. They thought, if an old lady like her can roller skate, we can too. and before long they could. The boys never really wondered why their mother made a number of these visits to relatives over the next few months. Not until they were adults did Ben and Curtis learn that those special occasions when their mother went away were actually times that she felt so overwhelmed by life that she would temporarily check herself into a mental hospital to get treatment for depression and emotional stress. Then, when she felt better and capable of coping with life again, she would check out and her sons would welcome her home. Life would go on after each trip. Every summer included one day at the Michigan State Fair. Sonia would save just enough money to pay for their admission so Ben and Curtis could take in the arts and crafts, agriculture, livestock, and educational exhibits. But they never had enough to pay for tickets to any of the midway rides. The boys could only watch other children on the rides and listen to the high-pitched screams as children were tossed and spun, whirled through the air. Ben especially liked watching children riding the bumper cars, banging into each other and laughing. For years he dreamed of driving one himself, and he tried to imagine what would that be like. Over time, Ben learned that he could find enjoyment by imagining many things. He had never flown on an airplane, or seen a luxury cruise ship, or been inside a limousine, or even eaten in a sit-down restaurant, but he had learned that his imagination could create vivid pictures of what such experiences would be like. Sonia Carson continued struggling to pay her bills and care for her sons. As the months passed by, it became clear that there was no way they could afford to stay in their Detroit home. To save money, Ben's mother decided to move her little family to Boston, Massachusetts. They would live with her older sister and brother-in-law, Ben's Aunt Jean and Uncle William Avery. Sonia explained to the boys that they would rent out their house in Detroit for enough money to cover the mortgage payments, and that way when times got better and she had saved enough money, they could move back into their home on Deacon Street. That is chapter 1. I feel like I need to read one more chapter actually 2 more, in order to make you understand what his life was like. It'll help you appreciate even more what a fine man he became. Chapter 2. Beantown Rats, Spiders, and Change. Ben felt sad about leaving his home and friends in Michigan to live in a tenement building in Boston. But it wasn't long before he found out there was definitely an upside to living with the Averys. Their children were grown, so they had lots of love to show 2 young boys. That first Christmas the Carsons lived in Boston, Ben's aunt, uncle, and mother showered the boys with gifts. Ben's favorite present was a chemistry set. He spent hours in his room reading the instructions, mixing chemicals, and watching them react. One of his experiments left the whole apartment smelling like rotten eggs, and Ben thought that was hilarious. Not everything about the move was positive, however. Ben hated the rats that roamed in packs in the weeds behind the apartment building. Big rats, ugly rodents, nearly as big as cats, lots of them. The horrid creatures usually stayed away from the building, but in cold weather the rats sometimes took refuge in the basement. Once a big snake slithered into the basement. Someone killed it, but afterward all the neighborhood kids told stories about snakes eating children. Between the rats he'd seen and the snakes he'd heard about, Ben was always afraid to go into the basement. When they did feel the need for outdoor adventure, Ben and Curtis often played in a park not far from their apartment building. There they would imagine their own mountain climbing and Wild West exploits as they scampered up and over and around the large rock formations. One day Ben climbed across the face of a rock wall on a dangerously high and narrow ledge. With one hand firmly jammed in a crack, he plastered his body against the rock as tightly as he could, slowly easing himself forward and feeling for some place to hold on with his other hand. Suddenly, a chunk of ledge gave way beneath his feet. Ben was now dangling by just one hand. He listened to the sound of the broken rock hitting the ground far below. He looked, and just an arm length ahead, the remaining ledge looked wider and stronger. But how could he get there? He needed a new handhold to reach it. From where Ben hung, he spotted another crevice that he thought he could reach with his free hand. If he could get a good grip there, he could swing himself over the ledge. The trouble was, he could see a thick spider's web stretched across the opening. Ben loved all kinds of animals. Well, almost all kinds of animals. He absolutely hated spiders. They terrified him. And he had seen some humongous wolf spiders with webs just like this one among the rocks of that park. He had thought, there's no way I will stick my hand in the nest of wolf spiders. Then Ben looked down. He was a long way up, and the ground below was rocky. He did not want to think about how badly he'd be hurt if he fell from this height. But he was terrified of spiders. Right then, he was actually more afraid of falling. I need a handhold in that crevice, Ben had told himself. So he stretched, and he put his hand through the spider's web and into that opening in the rock. He gained a solid grip, swung his feet onto the ledge, and quickly scampered safely off that rock wall. Ben learned an important lesson. Sometimes to survive, you need to face your fear and overcome it. The added sense of danger that Ben experienced living in Boston wasn't merely the result of a young boy's fertile imagination. His new neighborhood was definitely tougher than the one he'd left in Detroit. He'd often encountered homeless drunks sleeping on sidewalks outside the apartment building. All hours of the day, police cars raced through the streets, their sirens blasting and lights flashing. One of the Avery sons was shot to death on those streets. Ben had liked and looked up to that young adult cousin. But in addition to feeling a terrible sadness over his cousin's senseless death, Ben realized that his cousin, by associating with drug dealers, had been doing something that he shouldn't have been doing when he was killed. That too was a valuable lesson. Ben made up his mind right then. Some things are not worth the risk. While the Carson family lived in Boston, Ben's mother made 2 or 3 more visits to relatives for 3 or 4 weeks at a time. But Ben and Curtis, though they missed their mother, never worried. They never questioned why she had to leave. They trusted Aunt Jean and Uncle William to take great care of them. Ben and Curtis were usually a bit spoiled by the time their mother returned. In Boston, just as she had done back in Detroit, Ben's mother worked for several well-to-do families, caring for their children or cleaning their houses. Many days she left for work early in the morning before her boys went to school and didn't get home until almost bedtime. Just the same, she always took the time to ask Ben and Curtis what they were doing and learning in school, no matter how tired she was or how many hours she had worked that day. Ben and his brother knew that their mother thought their education was important, and she wanted them to excel in school, and they did. Both boys did well in their classes at the small private school that they attended in Boston. Ben's mother wanted her sons to learn the importance of setting goals in life. Almost every day, she talked to Ben and Curtis about her own goal of saving money to someday move back to their home in Detroit. Sonia Carson also taught her sons the value of $1. For instance, riding to school on a city bus cost 20 cents a day, the same price as a loaf of bread then. So Ben and Curtis rode their bikes to school, and the money they saved was used to buy groceries for the family. Ben's mother liked to say, "A penny saved is a penny earned." The boys learned never to be late in returning a library book. They never walked past an alley without looking to see if they could spot a bottle that they could turn in for a penny deposit. No amount of money was too small when it came to spending or saving. There were other important lessons that Sonia managed to teach her sons, and Ben was reminded of one of them the day a store clerk made the mistake of giving him too much change. Instead of a $1 bill, she handed Ben a 10. Even before he walked out the door of the store, he realized the mistake and excitedly began to fantasize. What could I do with my extra $9? But by the time he reached home, Ben had a knot in his stomach the size of a fist, in which he still clutched his money. And he no longer felt so great about his good fortune. Ben recognized the feeling that he was experiencing. It was called guilt. He knew keeping the money wouldn't be honest, and honesty was an important principle he'd learned from his mother as well as at church. Ben immediately turned around and he walked back to the store where he returned the $10 bill to the clerk and explained what happened. She gave him the correct change, and he strode out of the store, $9 poorer, but feeling on top of the world. Recalling the incident years later, Ben would say, "That experience reinforced for me an even more important truth than virtue of honesty. It reminded me that there is such a thing as right and wrong, and when you do what is right based on the principles you believe in, the satisfaction that results is better than having money." During their 2 years in Boston, the Carson family saved enough pennies, nickels, and dimes to move back to Michigan. They still couldn't afford to live in the little house on Deacon Street, but they were closer, and the boys were glad to be near their old friends. However, a few weeks after they returned to school in Detroit, both Ben and Curtis realized that they had a serious problem. In Boston, they had been among the better students in their classes. In Detroit, they were behind in their classes. Ben understood so little of what his class was studying that he began to fear his dream of becoming a missionary doctor was drifting out of reach. He also began to believe what the other kids were saying about him. Which leads us to Chapter 3. The Dumbest Kid in 5th Grade. "Hey, dummy!" Ben looked up. Dummy was the nickname his new classmates had given him. Another 5th grader laughed at Ben's instinctive response. "Ben Carson is so dumb." Ben shrugged and tried to act as if he didn't mind. He didn't like being called dumb. Who would? But he figured what the students said was true. After all, he heard it every single day. "Ben Carson's the dumbest kid in 5th grade, the classmates continued. Ben looked the other way. He wasn't in the mood to argue. "Hey, Carson's the dumbest kid in the world," another kid called out. "Now, wait a minute," Ben thought. "I know I'm dumb, but I have plenty of test grades to prove that. But somewhere in the world there's got to be someone dumber than me." It was time to draw the line. "I am not the dumbest kid in the world." "You are too." "I am not," Ben insisted. "Couldn't be anybody in the world dumber than you are, Carson." The two argued back and forth until the teacher called the class inside. Later the same afternoon, there was a math quiz. After the teacher instructed each student to pass his test to the person behind him to correct, as the teacher read out the answers, Ben knew what was going to come next. Each student would have to report his or her score to the teacher out loud. Ben stared with disgust at the big fat 0 on the top of his paper. "When everybody finds out what I made on this quiz," he thought, "they'll never let up." That's when Ben began to scheme. "Maybe if I mumble," he thought, "the teacher won't understand me." So when the teacher called his name, he muttered, and it worked. 9, Benjamin? How wonderful. Class, can you see what Benjamin has done? Didn't I tell you if you just applied yourself, you could do it? I'm so proud of you. 9 right would mean Ben had a 21 wrong, but 9 was still a lot better than his usual grade. That must have been why the teacher kept raving on. at least until the girl who had graded Ben's paper decided to set the record straight. "He said none," she spouted. "You know, none, as in not any." After a short pause, a chorus of laughter broke out in the room. The teacher shook her head as she sat down in her chair. Ben wanted to disappear, but he couldn't, so he just grinned and he tried to pretend the laughter didn't bother him. Ben felt especially dumb when all the 5th grade students at Higgins Elementary had their eyes tested. The boy ahead of Ben rattled off letters and numbers with ease. When Ben's turn came, he squinted and tried, but he couldn't make out any of the letters except for the very top line. He was so embarrassed. He couldn't even read an eye chart correctly. "No wonder the kids call me dummy," he mumbled. Being able to read an eye chart has nothing to do with being smart or dumb," the nurse had replied. "You just need glasses." Shortly after, a doctor fitted Ben with glasses. "Your vision is so bad," the doctor said, "you almost qualify as handicapped." Wearing glasses changed Ben's life. When he wore them to school, Ben couldn't believe the difference. He could actually read what the teachers wrote on the board, even from the back of the room. A few weeks later, Ben received his midterm grade report, and he was not surprised to see an F next to most of his subjects. His brother's report looked nearly the same way. When Ben got home, he dropped his grade card and his books on the table, hoping his mother wouldn't see the report until after he was in bed. But that didn't happen. "Benny, is this your midterm report?" she had asked, looking at it carefully. "Yes, ma'am," Ben replied, "but it doesn't mean much." "No, Benny," she answered, "it means a lot. If you keep making grades like this, you'll spend the rest of your life sweeping floors in a factory, and that's not what God wants for you." Sonia pulled Ben and Curtis close to her and looked right into their faces. "Boys, I don't know what to do, but God promises in the Bible to give wisdom to those who ask. So tonight, I'm going to pray for wisdom. I'm going to ask God what I need to do to help you." Ben and Curtis didn't know what to think about their mother's words. Had she gone off the deep end? Did she really think God was going to tell her how to help them get better grades? 2 days later, the boys found out God's answer to their mother's prayer, and they didn't like it. "God says you need to turn off the television." Sonia told her sons, "You may choose 3 TV shows to watch each week, but 3 times per week it is. You can use the extra time for reading." The boys complained and they tried to change her mind, but their mother wasn't finished. "You're also to write 2 book reports every week about what you read, and then you can present your reports out loud to me." God's answer didn't seem very wise to Ben or Curtis, but they did what their mother said. They turned off the television. They walked to the nearest branch of the Detroit Public Library, and they checked out a stack of books. Some people thought Ben's mother was being too hard on their sons. Several of her friends talked to her, telling her that the boys needed more time to play outside. They warned her that Curtis and Ben would hate her for making them turn off the TV, to read books, to write reports. But those people were wrong. Ben never hated his mother. Yes, he told her she was making them work too hard, but inside he knew she loved him and Curtis and only wanted the best for them. Ben believed her when she said that if he tried, he could do anything he wanted to do. Sonia was tough and demanding. One day while she and Ben were driving, the traffic stopped suddenly and another vehicle bumped them from behind. Without even getting out to see how much damage he had caused, the man in the other car quickly drove away. Ben's mom chased him all the way across Detroit before he finally gave up, pulled over, and got out to show Sonia his insurance information so that his coverage would pay for her car to get fixed. Sonia was just as tough and demanding with her sons. She had high expectations for Curtis and Ben, and she never let them forget it. She observed the lives and habits of the successful and wealthy people whose homes she cleaned every day. "They are no different from us," she told her sons. "Anything they can do, you can do. And if you really want to and you work hard, you can do it better." In Sonia's mind, education would be the key to her son's success. When other parents questioned the demands that she placed on Curtis and Ben, she would say to them, "Say what you want, but my boys are going to be something. They're going to be self-supporting and learn how to love other folks. And no matter what they decide to do, they're going to be the best in the world at it." The boys were grateful their mother hadn't said what they had to read. That meant they were free to choose books that interested them. Ben loved animals, so he read all the animal books he could find, and then he moved on to plants and rocks. The Carsons lived near railroad tracks. Soon Ben found himself collecting rocks in little boxes and taking them home to look them up in his library books. Before long, he could identify almost any rock he found. He was proud of himself, but he thought it wise not to mention his new hobby to anyone at school. One day, Mr. Jack, Ben's science teacher, walked into his 5th grade classroom with a big, shiny black rock. He held it up and he asked, "Can anyone tell me what this is?" Ben waited for one of the smart kids to answer. No one did, so he waited for one of the dumb kids to respond. More silence. Finally, Ben's hand went up, and as it did, his classmates began to whisper and giggle. "Hey, look," someone said. "Carson has a hand up. This ought to be good." Mr. Jack was surprised too. "Benjamin?" That's obsidian," Ben answered. Suddenly the classroom was quiet. It sounded good, but no one was sure it was the right answer or a joke. "That's right. It is obsidian," Mr. Jack exclaimed. No one else was saying anything, so Ben continued. Obsidian is formed after a volcanic eruption. Lava flows down, and when it hits water, there's a supercooling process, and the elements mix together, forcing out air, and then its surfaces kind of glaze. "Right again, Benjamin," Mr. Jack remarked with excitement in his voice. "Class, this is a tremendous piece of information Benjamin has just given us. I am proud of him." Before he went on with his lesson, Mr. Jack asked Ben to stop by after school. His teacher wanted to work on Ben's rock collection with him. Everyone stared at Ben in astonishment, but the most surprised person in the room was Ben himself. For the first time, he realized that he was not a dummy at all. Ben also realized that he had known the answer because he had been reading books. And as that sank in, he began to wonder, what if I read books about all my subjects? Maybe I would know more than anyone in the class. Maybe the kids who tease me and call me names, I'd be smarter than them. Ben had made a giant discovery, but he couldn't yet imagine how much reading would change his life. The truth was, he had found the key that would unlock his future and someday enable his greatest dreams to come true. And that's why I had to read 3 chapters. Not only is this man, if you don't know, there it is. Not only did Ben Carson become a pediatric surgeon, a neurosurgeon, literally operating on brains of people and saving children's lives. Not only that, but he did run for office. He had tried to be the president for a little while and other great things. But just he realized the wonderfulness of reading and how that can just change a person's life. It's the equalizer. Learn to read and you can be whatever you want to be. So I hope you appreciate that message. I hope you want to find out what else happens in his life and you look more into the biography of Ben Carson. I'm sure that you will appreciate it just like I have. And I hope you have a wonderful week. Thank you for watching and listening. Take care.